And same day as last week, filming, we got another video. Real Railroads, Episode 8, Rochester and Southern. Behind me will be photos taken on the Rochester and Southern, or all of Rochester and Southern trains, not necessarily on Rochester and Southern tracks, and not necessarily the locomotives. There is quite a few freight cars pictures in here, yeah. Today, the Rochester and Southern is approaching 40 years old, but its origins can be traced to the 1870s. It operates routes that were once used by the Silver Lake Railway, Rochester and State Line, Buffalo, Rochester and Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Ohio, Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, Erie, Lackawanna, Conrail, Dansville, Morris, New York Central, and Genesee, Wyoming. The Silver Lake Railway section of track is from Silver Lake Junction down the hill into Silver Springs. This is today referred to as the Perry Main and was 10 feet from the kitchen window of the apartment I lived in when I was 11 to 17. The Perry Main once continued out to Weaver Road and was used as a storage rip track. The bridge, however, washed out and cut the track down to about a quarter mile of what it had been. This continued being used for storage of cars and being interchanged until I believe it was around 2006 to 2009. Now you can't even tell that track was ever there. Under Rochester and Southern ownership, it went out to Weaver Road, but originally, it went all the way into Perry, served ice houses and such. I'll cover that in another video once I gather enough information and can write a script for it. The Rochester and State Line section is the longest, stretching from Silver Lake Junction all the way to beyond Ridge Road in Rochester. When the RSR was formed, they operated all the way down to Machias Junction. This was poorly maintained and prone to flooding as it runs through swampland. Walking the line today, you will come across puddles. It gets muddy even with ballast still there. From Silver Lake Junction to Machias Junction was abandoned in 1987. It could be reactivated as ever needed, and it was discussed that it would be reopened partly to serve a landfill that was planned, but the landfill was stopped from being started. This became the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh, and then the B&O before becoming CSX, and then RSR in quick succession. The DL&W EL Conrail trackage is the former DL&W Buffalo Division between Greggsville and Groveland Station, which was acquired by the Genesee, Wyoming. RSR acquired it through the merger with the GNWR. The DNMM trackage runs from Groveland Station to the former Foster Wheeler plant in Dansville. This also came from the merger with the GNWR. This trackage was once embargoed after Foster Wheeler closed, but today serves American Motor Power Incorporated, sometimes gets shipments of windmill parts, and has a transload that receives covered hoppers. The NYC trackage is a short section of the NYC Peanut used to serve NY Bean if it's still rail served, and Jones Chemical in Caledonia. The original RSR trackage is the former Rochester and State Line from Rochester to Silver Lake Junction, and is what they took over in 1886 to 1987. 1986 to 1987. I think it said 1886, but the RNSL had been created to bring coal from Pennsylvania to Rochester, New York. Organized on April 8, 1869. This was to be an affordable way to bring coal up from PA, as existing railroads in Rochester had raised the price of coal from $6 per ton in 1863 to $17 per ton in 1865. Thank you, Vanderbilt. William Wallace, no, not give me freedom. Not freedom! The surveyor of the Scottsville and Leroy Railroad, mentioned in the first episode of the series, was the one to initially survey the route. The RNSL opened between Rochester and Leroy in 1874, and then in 1878 service had reached Salamanca. Eventually, it would reach Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It had initially been planned to build it from Rochester to Wellsville, but discovery of new coal fields pushed the route to the west. Passing through the route, it ended up taking over to Salamanca and down to Pittsburgh. The initial route would have passed through Perry, Castile, and on down to Wellsville, New York. The change in route was brought about the Silver Lake Railway, which linked Perry with East Gainesville, now Silver Springs. and the RNSL. The RNSL came under Vanderbilt's control and was pretty much killed. Reorganized on January 29, 1881, it became the Rochester and Pittsburgh Railroad and went bankrupt 4 years later. It was split into the Pittsburgh and State Line Railroad Company and the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh Railroad. The RMP and BRMP shipped coal and coke from Pennsylvania to the coal dock in Rochester. By 1913, they were transloading 1 million tons per year through the dock. Grand Trunk Railway provided cross-lake ferry service in Rochester and transporting passengers and loaded coal cars across to Canada from the RMP and BRMP. The traffic and trains by 1920 averaged 3,750 tons. The Baltimore and Ohio acquired the BRMP in 1932 and would operate until 1986 when CSX was formed. The portion from Rochester to Machias Junction was sold to the Rochester and Southern, but CSX Power, usually former Chessie System units, would continue to be used until 1987 when the section from Silver Springs to Machias was abandoned. The rest of the BRMP remained with CSX until 1988 when the Buffalo and Pittsburgh got the remainder to Pittsburgh. Today, the RSR is a GWI company, as it has been since its inception. The northernmost track is a track that once went to Charlotte, where it joined with Conrail's Charlotte Runner. The farthest north industry is Matthews and Fields Lumber in Charlotte, but the track is overgrown north of Dewey Avenue, just north of Kodak. Kodak was once busy interchanging with CSX and Rochester and RSR. It received coal, chemicals, etc. for the manufacture of film and other Kodak products. The RSR Kodak Interchange Yard has a total of 10 tracks and once had two coal piles near it, with the Kodak engine house shop on the south end, with 2 tracks passing and 2 tracks into it. The shop remains, as does the yard. Kodak Park is now mostly under their industries, with more space available for lease or purchase, and has the potential to become a large industrial park serving multiple industries, larger than it already is. It's over 1 million square feet. It's over 1 million square feet. I can't remember the size of it, but it's got I think it's 100 industries, and I read online. It's now called Eastman Business Park. The remaining power plant is shuttered. The 2 in-plant yards are used infrequently. Only a few hoppers, tank cars, and boxcars move now. How much business is in the former complex, I am unsure of. The entire place looks desolate on Google Maps. South of Kodak is another spur to Miller Brick. This I am not sure is rail-served, but has the potential. Next comes Flower City Tissue Mills, another industry with a spur, but it can't confirm if they are actively switched there. They're listed online as switching there, but the information online about what industries Rochester and Southern serves today in Rochester is from 1990s. It's not accurate. It's not likely to be accurate today. Passing Flower City, the tracks cross Jobbing Park Avenue on a girder bridge, then a parking lot on a through-truss bridge before reaching the spur for American Packaging Corporation. This is still rail-served and receives covered hoppers of plastic pellets and a 4-car switchback spur with an approximately 8 to 10 car switching lead. This track, it goes, we'll draw it out here. It goes, the main comes down from Charlotte, the track goes back this way, and then American Packaging's track is this way. So it has to be served from going north. They have to pull in to American Packaging with the cars and do their switching and then shove out back to their train and then continue up north. Okay. Crossing Lexicon Avenue, we pass a formerly rail-served industry that is now occupied by 2 different businesses. Then comes Jamestown Container Companies, Rochester, which appears to have been rail-served once but is no more. We then cross over Ferrano Street and the CSX Industrial Spur that sits and rots without business. We then, just before going over 490, reach the Canal Side Business Center, which is another location for American Packaging. This one not rail-served, and American Plywood, which is or appears to be rail-served still. The center, as it two-track yard, but it's in disrepair and the rails are rusting. South of 490 is Arch Chemicals, which has two active spurs. Then we cross the CSX main line in a through-truss bridge and reach the RSRY. Going to the left will take you around an industrial area into the CSX, where you would run east past the CSXY, the Amtrak station, and finally to Goodman Street Yard, where the RSR Job C1 interchanges with CSX. Going right, you swing around the Central Auto Auction and head south, crossing the Erie Canal and entering RSR Brooks Avenue Yard in Gates, New York, after facing point spur that serves a tank farm with two unloading tracks for diesel fuel. Brooks Ave Yard's north end is 11 tracks, 9 for classification and 2 for locomotives. It then narrows to 4 by the yard office and crossing Brooks Ave before widening to 7 tracks, 6 for classification, and the 7th is half for classification and half a team track. This is where utility poles for RG&E are unloaded and gondolas of scrap are loaded. The tracks then narrow to one paralleling the airport, leading to Genesee Junction, where the RSR goes under the CSX West Shore and meets with the LA&L. The RSR main line continues straight, southwest through Chile, before turning due south for Scottsville. At Scottsville, they then turn west and continue to Mumford, Caledonia, Leroy, and then south to Pavilion and point south. There is a disused spur in Mumford, where Burnwell Propane once stood, but the next industries are not until Caledonia. And Caledonia is Commodity Resource Corporation, a large feed facility with an assigned switcher and 2 unloading tracks. CRC uses former Lehigh Valley tracks, and a connector goes to the former NYC peanut line to access NY Bean plant, which might be offline, and Jones Chemical, which is very much rail-served, with 2 unloading tracks and 10 spotting locations. At Caledonia is P&L Junction, where the RSR splits. There is a 3-track yard for CRC, 2 of which lead the unloading area. There is also the former G&W that turns south, crossing Route 5 to head south. There are 2 yard tracks that once served as interchange, but no longer. The original RSR trackage continues east to Leroy, taking the former G&W south, would take you through woods and fields to FS Gromark Agriculture, which receives tank cars, then a disused spur at a group of silos where sits a rotting passenger car. You then enter Retzoff, where the G&W started. The north leg of the Retzoff Y is abandoned. The roundhouse is still used for light repairs and cleaning. The yard is used for car repair, but only 9 tracks are semi-usable. This is where G&W R50 sits with a blown main generator, likely to be cut up on site as GWI acquires more and more used 4-axle locomotives in better condition. You would then cross under NY63. This is where Greggsville Yard begins. This is 3 extra tracks used to store salt hoppers during the off-season. To the left is the former International Salt, which is closed, and the property is now used by American Rock Salt. There are 2 spurs here, the 2 former loading tracks at the mine, and another that is used for boxcars. The main and yard turns west before the yard ends, and the main meets with the former DL&W and continues south through Leicester and Mount Morris. At Mount Morris, the DL&W crosses the Genesee River on a large bridge that passes behind a cement business. It then reaches the branch line that runs out to American Rock Salt's mine, a 4 million plus ton per year operation with a 9,000 acre mine, 1,000 to 1,700 feet below the surface, with 189 acres of complex above that includes 2 tracks for a 1-track loading area, and loads approximately 3 million tons of rock salt per year, and has its own pair of SW1001 switchers assigned to it, still in G&WR lettering. The mine can store 30,000 tons of salt inside and 500,000 tons outside the buildings, awaiting the times of year when loading outpaces mining operations. The former DL&W then passes the privately owned passenger depot and then an industrial spur that serves Allied Frozen Storage and Golden Oaks Foods. There are no more industries in the DL&W. It runs down the Groveland station where there once was a large engine facility, decent yard, an interchange with the DMM. And an interchange with the DMM. Now the RSR just curves onto the north leg of the Y to DMM trackage and runs to Dansville, where they have another Y in the complex that once was Foster Wheeler. Now it's American Motive Power, LMC Industrial Contractors, and another unknown industry. This receives locomotives, covered hoppers, and windmill parts. Back in Caledonia, the RSR Maine continues to Leroy, where it serves Carolina Eastern Crocker in 2 locations, on a siding east of Leroy where they unload tank cars on a siding, and a spur behind Stoda Warehouse where they unload potash. Also in Leroy, they serve the Stoda Warehouse and used to serve Lap Insulator, but the spurs at Lap are gone. The next location is Pavilion, with the last 2 industries served by the RSR job BL1R, Hanson Aggregates and Carolina Eastern Crocker again. Southbound, Hanson is facing point, and CEC is trailing point for switches, with no runaround, making BL1 have to run with a locomotive on each end if cars are going to Hanson or cars are to be pulled from CEC. From Pavilion, it's a boring run to Silver Springs, where RSR job RS1 serves Morton Salt and interchanges up to 110 cars with NS 5+ days a week. The RSR currently has 4 jobs. C1 runs between Brooks Ave Yard and Goodman Street Yard, interchanging CSX. BL1 switches all industries on the RSR except the salt mines. GW1 is a salt unit train that serves American Rock Salt, and RS1 interchanges with NS in Silver Springs and switches Morton Salt. Original power for the RSR was chassis locomotives, which were replaced with 6 GP40 road switchers and 2 SW1200 yard switchers. Today, the RSR still owns a GP9-3, number 879, on their property. GNWR SW1001 switchers, 1000 and 1001, usually stationed at the mine, and GNWR 50, a retired GP38, along with the former Kodak MP15AC and MP15DC. They also own a GP40-3M road slug set, 3807 and 807, which is assigned to the BPRR. The rest of their current power is from other GWI properties. Buffalo and Pittsburgh is a majority, with 2 SD40-3s, an SD40-2, 2 GP40-3s, a GP40-2, a GP38-2. Within Ohio Central, Gensid, and Wellsboro Corning SD40-3 rounding out the current power. RSR in the past has other sister roads power, mostly BPRR, GP40, GP38-2, GP38, GP9, GP18, and such. The last RSR, GP40, number 104, was rebuilt into a GP40-2 a few years ago, and is elsewhere in the GWI empire. That concludes the information on the Rochester and Southern. Next week, we'll be covering the Arcade and Attica. This has been episode 8 of Real Railroads. Stay tuned for episode 9 next week. And it is now dark outside. Bye.